She had 11 children, and she buried a husband at 39 while carrying the last of them. Ethel Kennedy was the wife of Robert F. Kennedy, and on a June night in 1968, in the kitchen of a Los Angeles hotel, she knelt over his dying body and then went home to raise their children alone, the 11th born 6 months after the gunshots. For the next half-century, she was the indestructible matriarch of Hickory Hill, the keeper of the Kennedy flame, fierce and devout and famously demanding. But behind the touch football photographs and the dynastic mythology, the branch of the family she headed carried a darker inheritance than any. Her son David died of an overdose in a Florida hotel room in 1984. Her son Michael died in a skiing accident in 1997. Others struggled, vanished from the public eye, or were quietly managed out of the family narrative. In a clan that built its entire power on the image of a glorious golden brood, Ethel Kennedy raised 11 children into a legend that, the closer you look, seems to have forgotten most of them. This is the story behind the photographs. The record corrects one small detail before we go further, because it matters to the arithmetic of what she carried. The brief frame says 39. In fact, she had just turned 40. Ethel Skakel Kennedy was born on the 11th of April, 1928, in Chicago, and her husband was shot in the early hours of the 6th of June, 1968. She was, to the day, 8 weeks past her 40th birthday. It is a tiny correction, and it does not soften the scene at all. If anything, it sharpens it. A woman of 40, pregnant with her 11th child, kneeling on a pantry floor in the Ambassador Hotel with her hand on her husband's face. That is where this story begins, and it is worth staying there for a moment, because almost everything the public would later believe about Ethel Kennedy was built to keep us from looking too closely at that floor. The man on the floor was Robert Francis Kennedy. He had won the California primary a few hours earlier. He had spoken to his supporters in the embassy ballroom, and then he had been led out through a service corridor toward a press conference, shaking hands as he went. A young busboy named Juan Romero reached out to shake his hand, and that is the moment the photographs froze. Romero crouched over him, and Ethel pushing through the crowd to reach him. The gunman, Sirhan, was 24 and carried a .22 revolver. Robert Kennedy was pronounced dead the following day. He was 42, and the woman beside him, who had been his wife for 18 years, went home to Virginia to raise the 11 children they had made together, the youngest of whom had not yet been born. That youngest child arrived on the 12th of December 1968 at Georgetown University Hospital. Her mother named her Rory, after the last High King of Ireland. Rory Kennedy would never meet her father. She would grow up to be a documentary filmmaker, and decades later she would point a camera at her own mother and try, gently, to understand her. But that is the end of the story, and we are still at the beginning, on the pantry floor, with a widow and 10 living children and one more on the way. The question this video asks is simple, and it is not a kind question, so we will ask it carefully. What happens to children when they are raised not as people, but as proof? It is worth pausing on the sheer scale of what she had taken on, because the numbers themselves are part of the legend. By June of 1968, Ethel Kennedy had been pregnant 11 times in 17 years. The eldest, Kathleen, had been born in 1951. She was now 16 and old enough to understand exactly what had happened in Los Angeles. The next, Joseph, was 15, then Robert Jr., 14, David, 13, Courtney, 11, Michael, 10, Carrie, 8, Christopher, 4, Max, 3, Douglas, just past 1-year-old, and then the unborn 11th, a teenager at one end of the table and an infant at the other, and a mother in the middle who had just watched her husband die on television monitors in a hospital corridor. There was no precedent for this, no manual, and no second parent. Whatever else Ethel Kennedy became, she became it in the years immediately after that night, and the woman who emerged was harder and lonelier and more defended than the rah-rah girl who had bitten an ankle on a Virginia lawn. To understand the answer, you have to understand the woman first. In his 2000 book Jackie, Ethel, Joan, Women of Camelot, the biographer J. Randy Taraborelli set the 3 Kennedy wives side by side, Jacqueline, Ethel, and Joan. And what binds them in his telling is not glamour but a single, tragic, common bond. Each of them married into a family whose mythology would, sooner or later, cost them almost everything. Of the three, Ethel was the believer. Jacqueline kept a careful, ironic distance from the machine. Joan was broken by it. Ethel embraced it completely. And that is the thing you have to understand about her before anything else. She did not merely survive the Kennedy legend. She believed in it, fiercely, as an article of faith. And a person who believes in the machine will feed it without ever quite noticing what it consumes. Ethel Skakel was the sixth of 7 children, born to a father who had built a fortune out of almost nothing. George Skakel started as a railroad clerk, earning $8 a week, and ended as the founder of the Great Lakes Carbon Corporation, one of the largest privately held companies in the country. The Skakels were loud, athletic, devoutly Catholic on the mother's side, and richer than the Kennedys when Ethel married in. She went to Manhattanville College, where one of her classmates was Gene Kennedy, and through Gene, she met Gene's brother. The Ethel of those years comes down to us in one phrase, repeated in nearly every account: a rah-rah girl, athletic, fearless, exuberant, the loudest one in the room. She married Robert Kennedy on the 17th of June, 1950, at St. Mary Church in Greenwich, Connecticut, and she set about doing the one thing the family she had joined valued above all others. She had children, and that is where the legend really begins, because the Kennedys were not simply a large family. They were a large family on purpose, and the size was the point. Here is what the official record tends to leave out about those touch football afternoons. The image of the Kennedys, the photographs of a dozen tan children on a Cape Cod lawn, the legendary games of touch football, the sense of a clan so abundant and so golden that ordinary rules did not apply to it. That image was not an accident of a big Catholic family. It was a political instrument. Joseph Kennedy, the patriarch, had understood something about America before almost anyone else in public life. He understood that in a country that told itself it had no aristocracy, the next best thing to a royal family was a family that looked unstoppable, and nothing looks more unstoppable than children. Lots of children. Beautiful, healthy, laughing children. Generation after generation, as if the family had simply decided not to end. Ethel and her husband bought a house in McLean, Virginia, in 1957. It was called Hickory Hill, and they had purchased it from Robert's brother John and his wife Jacqueline. Hickory Hill became the stage on which the abundance was performed, the grounds filled with children and dogs and ponies, and the occasional sea lion. And then there was the football. The Kennedy touch football games at Hickory Hill became famous enough that they entered the national folklore. They were not gentle. Family members were, in the words of one account, notoriously competitive, and played by a rulebook of their own. Ethel was the fiercest of all. There is a story, repeated in the archives, that during one game, she bit the writer George Plimpton on the ankle. Whether it happened exactly that way almost does not matter. The story survived because it told people what they already believed, that this woman would do anything at all to win. And that ferocity, which looked so charming on a Virginia lawn, was the same ferocity she would need to survive the next 56 years. Because the abundance had a cost, and the cost would be paid by the children. Watch how the machine worked, and you start to see the bargain underneath it. A Kennedy child was born into a role before it was born into a personality. The role was to be evidence, evidence that the family endured, evidence that the dream had not died on a Dallas street in 1963 or in a Los Angeles pantry in 1968. The children were raised to compete, to win, to perform vigor and courage and faith, because the family's power depended on the performance never breaking. And for the most part, in public, it did not break. The photographs kept coming. The dynasty kept producing heirs. But behind the photographs, some of those children were not thriving. Some of them were drowning, slowly, in the very thing that was supposed to make them invincible. And the family, this is the video's argument, and we will be honest that it is an argument and not a documented fact. The family was so committed to the image of the golden brood that it struggled to see the individual children inside it. That brings us to the part the photographs could never show. It brings us to David. David Anthony Kennedy was the fourth of the 11, born in 1955. He was 13 years old when his father was shot, and he was, by some accounts, watching television in a hotel room in Los Angeles that very night when the bulletin came through. Whatever the precise sequence, the fact of it is documented and grievous. A boy of 13 who lost his father to public violence and never fully found his footing again. In the family's own private shorthand, the kind of phrase that surfaces in the biographies, David became known as the designated sick one. He struggled with addiction for years, and on the 25th of April, 1984, he was found dead on the floor of room 107 of the Brazilian Court Hotel in Palm Beach, Florida. He was 28 years old. The cause was a drug overdose, a combination of cocaine and a sedative. A woman who had spent time with him in the days before described him, to the Wire reporters, as sobbing and severely depressed. We are going to stop there, deliberately, and not go 1 inch further than the record allows. The public facts are these. David Kennedy died young, alone, in a hotel room, of an overdose, after years of a struggle that the family knew about and could not fix. That is all we know, and that is all we will say. We will not speculate about what happened in that room beyond what was reported. We will not assign blame. We will not reach for the private feelings of a mother who was not there. What we can say is only this, that a boy who lost his father at 13 in a family that demanded he be evidence of its strength became instead, in the family's own words, the sick one, and the gap between those two things, the role he was assigned and the person he became, is the truest measure of what the legend cost. There is a detail in the David story that tells you something about how the machine handled its own wreckage, and it is worth recording precisely because it is so quiet. When David was found, the family had requested the welfare check. Staff at the hotel went up to the room at the family's insistence. In the days that followed, there were arrests connected to the supply of the drugs, and there were photographs, and there were headlines. And then there was the long work of folding the whole thing back into the larger story. Within a few years, the public narrative of the Kennedys had reabsorbed David's death the way a body reabsorbs a bruise. He became a sentence in the curse, a name on a grim list, and that is exactly the mechanism this video is trying to point at. The legend did not have a category for a young man who simply could not bear the weight of being a Kennedy. So it filed him under tragedy, under curse, under the supernatural, and moved on. The curse, you have to understand, was always a convenience. It turned a series of human failures and human griefs into a kind of weather, something that happened to the family, rather than something that happened inside it. But David was not the only one. And the second loss, when it came, arrived in a way that seemed almost designed to indict the family's whole way of living. Michael Lemoyne Kennedy was the 6th of the 11, born on the 27th of February, 1958. He was a lawyer and an activist, and by the late 1990s, his life had become complicated and publicly troubled in ways we will not dwell on, because the brief asks us to handle these matters with care and not relish, and because a man's private difficulties are not the same thing as the public record of how he died. What we can say plainly is how he died. On the 31st of December 1997, New Year's Eve, the family was on a ski trip in Aspen, Colorado, and they were playing football on the slopes while skiing. They had invented a game in which they tossed a football back and forth as they came down the mountain, and the Aspen Ski Patrol had warned them more than once that it was dangerous and that they should stop. They did not stop. Late in the afternoon, Michael skied off, turned to catch a pass, and went headfirst into a tree. A witness described it in flat, terrible detail. He turns around to get a pass. He slams into a tree head first. He falls down unconscious. He was pronounced dead of head and neck trauma at around 10 minutes to 6 that evening. He was 39. And here is the part that should stay with you, because it is the whole argument of this video compressed into a single afternoon on a mountain. The thing that had been warned against, and done anyway, was the family ritual, the competition, the refusal to play by the ordinary rules that bind ordinary people. The same ferocity that made Ethel bite an ankle on a Virginia lawn in the 1960s was the ferocity that put a football in the air on an aspen slope in 1997. The abundance, the vigor, the performance of invincibility. It was beautiful, and it was deadly, and the family could not tell the difference. That is not an accusation of carelessness. It is something sadder. It is the observation that the thing that made the Kennedys magnificent was the same thing that, again and again, took their children from them. What the public never saw, in the years between these losses and after them, was the quieter cost. Because not every Kennedy child died young and famous. Some of them simply stepped out of the frame. This is the part of the story the brief calls the forgotten ones, and it is the part we have to handle most carefully of all. Because here the line between fact and interpretation is the thinnest. So let us be precise. Of Ethel's 11 children, several became public figures. Kathleen became a lieutenant governor of Maryland. Joseph and Robert Jr. went into politics. Robert Jr. would run for president in 2024. Carrie became a human rights activist. Rory became a filmmaker. But others lived lives so private that most people who can name the Kennedys could not name them. Christopher became a businessman in Chicago. Max became a lawyer and author. Douglas became a journalist. These are not lost people. They are living, documented, successful people who chose lives out of the glare. We say that clearly because the brief's frame, that the family forgot its children, is an argument about the myth, not an accusation against the living. But here is the argument stated as the argument it is. When you build a family's entire power on a slogan, 11 children, a dozen Kennedys, an endless golden generation, you do something to the individuals inside the slogan. You turn them into a number. The phrase 11 Kennedys is a unit of dynastic accounting. It is proof of fertility, proof of continuity, proof of immortality. And a number, by its nature, does not have a face. The public could hold the image of the golden brood far more easily than it could hold 11 separate, complicated, suffering, surviving human beings. And so, the ones who did not fit the image, the one who overdosed, the one who hit the tree, the ones who simply walked out of the photograph and built private lives, those were the ones the legend had the most trouble remembering, not because anyone forgot them in their hearts, but because the legend was never built to hold individuals. It was built to hold a number. And the family did not forget its dead. We should say this against ourselves, because it is true and the record demands it. Rory Kennedy made a feature documentary about her mother, released by HBO in 2012, simply called Ethel. The family has held memorials. It has issued tributes. The deaths of David and Michael were public, openly mourned, and never hidden. So when this video says forgotten, it does not mean the family failed to grieve. It means something more uncomfortable. It means that the public legend, the touch football photograph, the slogan of the golden brood, was so powerful that it swallowed the individuals whole, and that the family itself, in keeping the legend alive, helped the swallowing. The myth remembered the Kennedys. It did not always remember the children. There was, in the end, only one person whose whole life was given to keeping that myth intact. And it was the woman we left on the pantry floor. For 56 years, Ethel Kennedy was the keeper of the flame. She never remarried. She had been married to Robert Kennedy for 18 years. She would be his widow for 56. In that time, she founded the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights. She threw herself into the human rights and gun control causes her husband had championed, and she held the family together through loss after loss. Her son David in 1984, her son Michael in 1997, and then, into the next generation, her grandchildren. In 2019, her granddaughter Sarsa Kennedy Hill died at the family compound in Hyannisport at 22 of an apparent overdose, after having spoken publicly about her own struggles with depression. The following year, in 2020, her granddaughter Maeve Kennedy McKean and Maeve's 8-year-old son Gideon drowned in an accident on the Chesapeake Bay. The losses did not stop, and through all of them, Ethel remained what she had always been: fierce, devout, a daily communicant, the last great keeper of a legend that had cost her almost everything and asked for more. It is important to be fair to her here, because the easy version of this story makes Ethel a villain, and she was not one. She was a daily communicant who kept her faith through losses that would have shattered most people. She raised a lieutenant governor, a presidential candidate, a celebrated human rights advocate, and a documentary filmmaker. She turned the foundation she built in her husband's name into a serious instrument of human rights work, handing out the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award year after year to dissidents and organizers around the world. In her 80s, she was still marching, still protesting, still being arrested at demonstrations for causes she believed in. The fierceness that had once expressed itself in a touch football game had become, in old age, a kind of moral stubbornness that even her critics admired. She was not a woman who forgot. She was a woman who could not stop carrying. In 2014, President Obama gave her the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She was by then the matriarch not just of her own 11, but of a vast extended clan. She had been, the obituaries would later write, the one who channeled her grief into raising her children and into a lifetime of public service. And there is no cynicism that can touch that. Whatever the myth did to the children, the woman herself was the real thing, tough, faithful, and unbreakable to the end. The argument of this video was never aimed at her. It was aimed at the legend she served, and the difference matters. A person can give everything she has to a story and still be undone by the parts of that story she was never allowed to see. She died on the 10th of October, 2024, in Boston. She was 96. She had suffered a stroke the week before, and her grandson Joe Kennedy III announced her death. She was survived by 9 of her 11 children, by 34 grandchildren, and by 24 great-grandchildren. The arithmetic of the dynasty, at the moment of her death, was overwhelming, dozens upon dozens of descendants. The golden brood multiplied across 3 more generations, and she was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, beside the husband she had knelt over 56 years earlier, on a pantry floor in a Los Angeles hotel, with their 11th child not yet born. So let us return to where we started, to the number, because the number is the whole story. 11 children. It is a slogan, and it is also a fact. And the distance between the two is the thing this video has been trying to measure. As a slogan, 11 Kennedys is proof of immortality, evidence that the family was too golden and too numerous to ever truly end. As a fact, it is 11 separate people, each of them raised in the shadow of an assassinated father, each of them asked to be evidence of a strength the family could not always supply. 2 of them did not live to see middle age. Several of them stepped out of the light entirely. And the legend, which counted them so proudly by the dozen, never quite managed to hold them one by one. That is the bargain the dynasty made, and the woman on the pantry floor kept its terms for 56 years. The truth was quieter and colder than the photographs ever let on. The Kennedys wanted to be remembered as a family too large to die, and they got it. The name endures. The descendants number in the dozens. But immortality, it turns out, is a thing you buy on credit, and someone has to pay. It was not the name that paid. The name is doing fine. It was the children who carried it. Ethel Kennedy spent 56 years as the widow of a murdered man and the mother of 11 children, fierce to the end, the last great keeper of a legend built on the image of a family too golden and too numerous to die. And yet the closer you look at the 11, the more the legend dissolves into individual people. Some lost young, some lost quietly, all of them raised less as children than as evidence that the Kennedys would go on forever. The dynasty got its immortality. The name endures. It was the children who carried it who paid, and a family that counted them by the dozen never quite managed to remember them one by one.